May 1942, the Western Desert of North Africa. German tank commanders of the Afrika Korps watched with confidence as their panzer columns rolled toward British positions near Gazala. They had grown accustomed to dominance on this battlefield. For nearly 2 years, their tanks had consistently outmatched Allied anti-tank weapons. The British 2-pounder guns, firing their 40mm shells, were little more than annoyances against the upper-moored German tanks of 1942. Even direct hits often failed to penetrate. The Germans had learned to treat these weapons with casual disdain. But on this spring morning, something was different. Something the German tank crews did not yet understand would change the mathematics of desert warfare forever. Hauptmann Klaus Becker, commanding a company of Panzer Mark IIIs from the 21st Panzer Division, stood in his turret as his formation approached what appeared to be a standard British anti-tank position. Through his binoculars, he could see the distinctive shapes of what he assumed were the familiar 2-pounder guns. His tanks had taken hits from these weapons before. The shells bounced off or caused superficial damage. Nothing that stopped a German tank. Becker's confidence was not arrogance. It was born from experience. The Afrika Korps had spent months learning the ranges and capabilities of British weapons. They knew exactly how close they could approach before the 2-pounders became dangerous. And even at close range, a well-armoured panzer could usually survive. But what Becker was looking at through his binoculars were not 2-pounders. They were British Ordnance quick-firing 6-pounder guns. 57mm of high-velocity tank-killing power, and the Afrika Korps was about to receive a brutal education. The first German tank to enter the engagement zone was a Panzer Mark III Osif J, its frontal armour upgraded to 50mm, a solid piece of German engineering that had proven nearly invulnerable to the British 2-pounders at combat ranges. The tank commander never saw the British gun that killed him. At 800 yards, well beyond the effective range of the old 2-pounders, the 6-pounder fired. The armour-piercing shell, travelling at 2,693 feet per second, punched through the panzer's frontal armour as if it were sheet metal. The tank erupted in flames. The crew never had a chance to escape. Becker watched in shock as a second panzer, then a third, were destroyed at ranges he had thought safe. The British gunners were firing with devastating accuracy. Each shot seemed to find its mark. And unlike the 2-pounders, which often required multiple hits to disable a tank, these new guns were killing German armour with single shots. Within minutes, Becker's company had lost 6 tanks. 6 of his best crews, men who had fought from France to Egypt, were gone, burned alive or torn apart by the shells that ripped through their vehicles, and the British guns kept firing. The engagement at Gazala in May 1942 marked the combat debut of a weapon that German commanders had not anticipated and did not understand. The British Ordnance quick-firing 6-pounder and its American cousin, the 57mm Gun M1, would fundamentally alter the calculus of armoured warfare. But the transformation was not immediate. It required blood, mistakes, and hard lessons learned on both sides. The story of the 57mm anti-tank gun is not simply a tale of technological superiority. It is a story about how industrial capacity, tactical adaptation, and the courage of gun crews turned a weapon that German commanders initially dismissed into one of the most feared tank killers of World War II. The origins of this weapon lay not in the desperation of war but in the foresight of British engineers who understood what was coming. In 1938, even before the first shots of World War II were fired, designers at the Woolwich Arsenal in Britain began work on a replacement for the 2-pounder anti-tank gun. They understood that armour was getting thicker, that future tanks would be more formidable. They chose 57mm as the calibre for a practical reason. The British Royal Navy had been using 6-pounder guns since the 1880s. Manufacturing equipment already existed. Dies, lathes, production knowledge. It made economic sense. The design was completed by 1940. A conventional 2-wheeled carriage with split trails for stability. A 43 caliber barrel, meaning the barrel was 43 times the diameter of the bore. Simple, robust, and powerful. But then came disaster. In June 1940, the British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from Dunkirk. Left behind on the beaches of France were nearly 600 anti-tank guns. The British Army was stripped of its anti-tank capability at the exact moment when German invasion seemed imminent. Faced with this crisis, British planners made a painful decision. They would continue producing the inferior 2-pounder gun because retooling factories for the new 6-pounder would create a gap in production. They estimated that producing 100 6-pounders would cost them 600 2-pounders in lost production time. They could not afford that gap. So the 2-pounder remained in production, even though everyone knew it was inadequate. It was not until November 1941 that production of the 6-pounder finally began. By that time, British tank crews and anti-tank gunners had endured 18 months of combat armed with weapons they knew were obsolete. The frustration was immense. Gun crews watched their shells bounce harmlessly off German armour. Tank crews died because their own guns could not penetrate enemy tanks that killed them with ease. When the 6-pounder finally reached North Africa in early 1942, the reaction from British troops was electric. Finally, they had a weapon that could fight back. The 6-pounder weighed 2,521 pounds, substantially heavier than the 2-pounder's 1,800 pounds, but still light enough for a trained crew to manhandle into position. It could traverse 45 degrees in either direction and elevate from -5 to +15 degrees. The standard armour-piercing shot weighed 6 pounds, hence the name, and left the barrel at 2,693 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, it could penetrate 74 millimeters of armour. This was revolutionary performance in 1942. It meant that the 6-pounder could defeat the frontal armour of every German tank then in service. The Panzer Mark III with its 50mm front plate, the Panzer Mark IV with 80mm, even the new Mark IV specials with the long 75mm gun. All of them were vulnerable to the 6-pounder at combat ranges. Across the Atlantic, American military observers were watching British experiences with intense interest. By 1941, it was clear that America would eventually enter the war, and American planners understood that their own 37mm M3 anti-tank gun was already obsolete. It could not penetrate the armour of the latest German tanks. American infantry facing panzers would be slaughtered. In February 1941, before the United States had even entered the war, the decision was made to adopt the British 6-pounder. The Americans would call it the 57mm Gun M1. The choice served two purposes. It gave American forces a capable anti-tank weapon, and American factories could produce guns for Britain under Lend-Lease. 2 British 6-pounder guns and 100 rounds of ammunition were shipped to the United States to help American manufacturers understand the design. American production began in May 1941. The US-built guns had one significant difference from the British version. The Americans used a barrel that was 16 inches longer. The British had shortened the barrel on their production models because they faced a shortage of the specialised lathes needed to machine the longer tubes. America had no such shortage, so the M1 kept the longer barrel, making it a 50 caliber weapon. That extra length added about 100 feet per second to the muzzle velocity, giving the American version slightly better penetration at range. Otherwise, the two guns were nearly identical. Same caliber, same ammunition, same basic performance. By late 1942, more than 15,000 57mm M1 guns would roll off American production lines. But adoption and production were one thing. Getting the guns to the troops who needed them was another, and convincing skeptical commanders to use them was yet another challenge entirely. In 1942, as American forces prepared for combat, a bureaucratic battle erupted over the 57mm gun. The Army's Infantry Board, responsible for determining infantry equipment, opposed adopting the weapon. Their reasoning seemed logical on paper. The 57mm gun weighed 2,700 pounds in American configuration. It required a 3/4-ton truck or a half-track to tow it. The 37mm M3, by contrast, weighed only 912 pounds. It could be towed by a jeep. The Infantry Board argued that mobility and the low profile of the 37mm made it preferable for infantry use, despite its inability to actually kill German tanks. This was not simply bureaucratic stubbornness. It reflected a fundamental misunderstanding about modern armoured warfare. The Infantry Board was thinking in terms of World War I defensive tactics, small mobile guns that could be rushed into position to repel attacks. But World War II armour did not work that way. German tanks attacked with speed and combined arms coordination. A mobile gun that bounced shells off enemy armour was worse than useless. It got gun crews killed without stopping the attack. The Ordnance Department understood this. They pushed hard for the 57mm, but the Infantry Board resisted. Through 1942, American infantry trained with 37mm guns that everyone knew were inadequate. Officers returning from North Africa, where they had witnessed British 6-pounder success, begged for the heavier weapon. The infantry board held firm. Then came Tunisia. In November 1942, American forces landed in French North Africa as part of Operation Torch. By early 1943, they were pushing east into Tunisia, where they would face the Afrika Korps. Most American infantry units were still equipped with 37mm guns. What followed was a disaster. American anti-tank gunners watched in horror as their shells literally bounced off German tanks. Combat reports describe 37mm armour-piercing rounds hitting Panzer IVs and simply ricocheting away, leaving barely a scratch. German tank commanders learned quickly that they had nothing to fear from American anti-tank guns. They could approach American positions with impunity. One American infantry officer filed a report stating that the 37mm was useless at any range beyond 100 yards. Even at point-blank range, it struggled to penetrate the side armour of German medium tanks. Gun crews died manning weapons that could not protect them. The psychological impact was devastating. Anti-tank gunners knew they were being sent into combat with equipment that gave them no chance. Some commanders began pulling their anti-tank platoons out of the line entirely, using them as extra riflemen, because sending them forward with 37mm guns was effectively a death sentence. The reports from Tunisia finally forced the infantry board's hand. In spring 1943, they officially replaced the 37mm with the 57mm as the standard American infantry anti-tank gun. But the damage had been done. Months of combat time lost. Lives wasted because bureaucratic caution had trumped combat reality. By the time 57mm guns began reaching American units in significant numbers in mid-1943, a new reality was emerging. The weapon that British gunners had used to such devastating effect at Gazala was becoming obsolete, not because it was poorly designed, but because German armour was evolving faster than Allied weapons. In early 1943, Germany introduced two tanks that would dominate the battlefield for the remainder of the war: the Panther medium tank and the Tiger heavy tank. The Panther's frontal armour was 80mm thick but sloped at 55 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of over 140mm. The Tiger mounted 100mm of vertical armour on the front. Against these monsters, the 57mm gun struggled. British and American testing showed that the standard armour-piercing shot could not reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armour at any combat range. Against the Tiger, penetration was possible only at very close range, under 500 metres, and even then it was not guaranteed. Side and rear shots remained effective. A 57mm round punching through the thinner side armour of a Panther or Tiger would absolutely destroy the tank. But getting a side shot required tactical positioning that was not always possible. German tank commanders, once they understood the threat, learned to keep their frontal armour toward Allied anti-tank positions. The mathematics had shifted again, but this did not make the 57mm obsolete. Far from it, because the vast majority of German tanks were not Panthers and Tigers. They were Panzer IVs, Panzer IIIs, and self-propelled guns. Against these vehicles, the 57mm remained devastatingly effective. The most celebrated example of the 6-pounder's effectiveness came at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, at a position that would become legendary: Outpost Snipe. On the night of October 26, 1942, the 2nd Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, part of the British 7th Motor Brigade, moved into position in a shallow depression in the desert southwest of Kidney Ridge. With them were 19 6-pounder anti-tank guns, 13 from their own anti-tank company, and 6 from the 239th Anti-Tank Battery, Royal Artillery. Their mission was to establish an outpost that could serve as a jumping-off point for an armoured advance. What followed was one of the most extraordinary anti-tank actions of the entire war. At dawn on October 27th, the British troops realised they had misnavigated in the darkness. They were not quite where they had intended to be. Worse, as the sun rose, they discovered they were surrounded by German and Italian armour. Tanks from the 15th Panzer Division and elements of Italian armoured units were leaguered within 1,000 yards of Outpost Snipe. Some were close enough that British soldiers could see the German tank crews cooking breakfast. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner, commanding the position, faced an impossible situation. His 300 men and 19 guns were isolated, surrounded by hundreds of enemy tanks. But the depression they occupied provided some cover, and the British had dug in during the night. Turner made the only decision possible. They would fight. At 6:15 a.m. the German tanks began to move. 2 columns, one heading north, one heading southwest, both with their sides exposed to the hidden British guns. The 6-pounders opened fire. The 1st Panzer Mark IV, a special variant with the long 75mm gun, was knocked out at 30 yards range. It exploded in flames. More tanks died in quick succession. German and Italian armour scattered, trying to find cover, trying to locate the source of the devastating fire. For 30 minutes, the northern section of Outpost Snipe disappeared in smoke and explosions as German artillery and tanks returned fire, but the British guns kept firing. By the time the German column moved out of range, the gunners had claimed 6 German tanks, 8 Italian tanks, and 2 self-propelled guns destroyed. Throughout the day, German and Italian forces made repeated attempts to overrun Outpost Snipe. Each attack was met with accurate, devastating fire from the British 6-pounders. The gun crews worked with mechanical precision, despite constant artillery bombardment and machine gun fire. Wounded men continued to serve their weapons. When crews were killed, other soldiers took their places. The heat was unbearable. Flies swarmed over the dead and the wounded. The stench of burning tanks, cordite, and death was overwhelming, but the guns kept firing. At 4 p.m, German commanders launched their major attack. Tanks from the 15th Panzer Division and 21st Panzer Division moved forward in coordination. The British position was on the verge of being overrun. But the remaining 13 operational 6-pounder guns held firm. For hours they fired into the massed German armour. When the attack finally broke off, 22 German and 10 Italian tanks lay destroyed around Outpost Snipe. By nightfall, only one 6-pounder gun was still operational. The rest had been knocked out or were too damaged to continue fighting. Lieutenant Colonel Turner made the decision to withdraw under cover of darkness. Only one anti-tank gun from the 239th Battery could be recovered. The others had to be abandoned or destroyed. But the butcher's bill spoke for itself. The 19 6-pounder guns of Outpost Snipe had destroyed between 52 and 57 Axis armoured vehicles, depending on which count you trust, over 10% of Rommel's total tank strength at El Alamein. For this action, Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner was awarded the Victoria Cross. The defence of Outpost Snipe became one of the most celebrated anti-tank actions in British military history. And it demonstrated conclusively what well-positioned, well-handled, 6-pounder guns could do to armoured formations. But Outpost Snipe was not typical combat. It was an extraordinary action fought under extraordinary circumstances. The more common experience of 57mm gun crews was grinding, difficult combat against an enemy that learned quickly how to counter the weapon. German tank commanders developed tactics specifically to neutralise Allied anti-tank guns. They used artillery and infantry to suppress gun positions before tanks advanced. They coordinated attacks to overwhelm anti-tank defences. They learned to angle their armour to maximise effective thickness. And they introduced new tanks with armour that the 57mm struggled to penetrate. By the time American forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, the 57mm M1 was the standard anti-tank gun of US infantry divisions. But its effectiveness was limited by several factors beyond just armour penetration. The most significant problem was the lack of high-explosive ammunition. The 6-pounder and its American cousin were designed as anti-tank weapons. The ammunition was armour-piercing shot designed to penetrate steel plate. But infantry combat is not just about killing tanks. Anti-tank guns are frequently called upon to engage infantry positions, machine gun nests, fortified buildings. For these targets, armour-piercing shot is almost useless. It punches a small hole and passes through without causing significant damage. What you need is high explosive shells that detonate on impact, creating blast and fragmentation. The British developed HE ammunition for the 6-pounder relatively quickly. American production lagged badly. It was not until after the Normandy landings that American troops began receiving HE rounds for their 57mm guns, and even then supplies were limited. Throughout the Italian campaign and the early months of Normandy, American anti-tank gunners had only armour-piercing ammunition. When asked to support infantry attacks on fortified positions, the 57mm was nearly worthless. One battalion commander wrote in frustration that his 57mm guns were the only weapons in the infantry regiment, with a flat trajectory suitable for direct fire support, but without HE ammunition they could not fulfill that role. American troops resorted to scrounging British HE ammunition whenever possible. The second major problem was mobility, or rather, the perception of mobility. The 57mm gun weighed 2,700 pounds. It required a 3/4-ton truck or a half-track to tow it. In the bocage country of Normandy, with its narrow lanes and thick hedgerows, moving these guns into position was difficult. Once in place, they were hard to relocate quickly. German commanders learned that once a 57mm position was identified, it could be suppressed with artillery or bypassed entirely. The gun's weight became a tactical liability. Infantry commanders began expressing preference for lighter, more mobile anti-tank weapons. The bazooka, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher, could be carried by 2 men. It could be repositioned instantly. In the close terrain of Normandy, bazookas proved more useful than towed anti-tank guns in many situations. This led to a strange reversal of the earlier debate. The same infantry board that had resisted the 57mm in 1942 because it was too heavy was now proven partially correct. In certain combat environments, the gun's weight was indeed a problem. But the solution was not to return to lighter, but ineffective weapons. The solution was combined arms doctrine. Use the right weapon for the right situation. In open terrain, where German armour could manoeuvre at range, the 57mm reach and penetration were essential. In close terrain, lighter weapons had advantages. Both had their place. Despite these limitations, the 57mm M1 played a crucial role in several key actions. During Operation Lüttich, Hitler's desperate armoured counterattack at Mortain in August 1944, American anti-tank guns were critical in stopping the German advance. The counterattack aimed to cut off American forces that had broken through the western end of the German lines in Normandy. Success would have changed the course of the campaign. German armour, including Panthers and Mark IVs, attacked American positions. The defending troops included infantry with 57mm anti-tank guns. The gunners fought with desperate courage. They knew that if the German tanks broke through, the entire American position in Normandy could collapse. Gun after gun was knocked out by German fire. Crews were killed or wounded, but the survivors kept fighting. They engaged German tanks at close range, going for side and rear shots where the 57mm could still penetrate. The Battle of Mortain was ultimately decided by American air power. Rocket-firing fighter bombers devastated the German columns. But on the ground, it was infantry and anti-tank gunners who held the line until the aircraft arrived. The 57mm guns earned their keep in blood. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, 57mm gun crews again found themselves in desperate combat. German armour attacked through the Ardennes in winter conditions. The muddy, snow-covered roads made moving anti-tank guns extremely difficult. Once emplaced, the guns could not be relocated. Casualty rates among anti-tank units were horrific. In December 1944, First Army's 57mm units suffered 26% casualties. Compare that to the 6 to 8% monthly casualty rate these units experienced in Normandy. The guns themselves were effective when properly positioned, but the inability to manoeuvre them in winter conditions made the crews sitting ducks for German artillery. Once again, infantry commanders reported that bazookas were preferable in these conditions. A bazooka team could hide in a building or behind a wall, fire, and immediately relocate. A 57mm gun, once it was spotted, drew concentrated fire and could not escape. But this was not a failure of the weapon itself. It was a mismatch between weapon capability and tactical situation. The 57mm was designed as a defensive anti-tank weapon for relatively open terrain. Asking it to perform in close-terrain urban combat or winter forest fighting was asking it to do something it was not designed for. Where the 57mm excelled was in exactly the kind of combat it was designed for. Open terrain engagements where German armour had to close within effective range. In North Africa and Sicily, in the open country of northern France after the breakout from Normandy, the 57mm remained a potent tank killer. German tank commanders learned to respect it. They knew that rushing an emplaced 57mm position meant casualties. They used artillery and combined arms to suppress these guns before advancing. The mere presence of 57mm guns in a defensive position changed German tactics. They forced the Germans to approach more carefully, to coordinate their attacks more thoroughly, to take time. And in mobile warfare, time is often the most valuable resource. Every hour German commanders spent organising a deliberate attack against anti-tank positions was an hour Allied forces used to strengthen defences or prepare counterattacks. There was also the question of what the 57mm gun represented psychologically to German soldiers. For the Afrika Korps, the appearance of the 6-pounder in 1942 was a shock. They had grown accustomed to armour superiority. British anti-tank weapons had been ineffective. German tanks could approach British positions with relative confidence. The 6-pounder ended that. Suddenly, ranges that had been safe were lethal. German tank commanders who had learned to operate based on one set of assumptions now had to relearn the battlefield. They had to respect Allied anti-tank capabilities in a way they had not before. This psychological shift should not be underestimated. Confidence is crucial in armoured warfare. Tank commanders must be willing to advance, to take risks, to press attacks. If they become cautious, if they begin to fear enemy anti-tank weapons, their effectiveness drops. The appearance of effective Allied anti-tank guns forced German tank commanders to become more cautious, more defensive. It slowed their operations. By 1945, the 57mm gun was clearly reaching the end of its useful life as a frontline weapon. The newest German tanks, the Panthers and Tigers and King Tigers, were too heavily armoured. The gun could still kill these monsters with side shots, but frontal penetration was no longer reliable. Newer American weapons were entering service. The 76mm gun on the late-model Sherman tanks, the 90mm gun on the M36 tank destroyer, and the new M26 Pershing heavy tank. These weapons could defeat German heavy armour frontally at combat ranges. The 57mm day, as the primary American anti-tank weapon, was ending. But over 15,000 had been produced. They could not simply be discarded. So they served on, increasingly in secondary roles: static defence positions, training weapons, equipment for second-line units. The gun saw post-war service in several conflicts. The Israelis used 6-pounders mounted on half-tracks during their 1948 War of Independence. The weapon proved effective against the light armour available in that conflict. During the Korean War, both American and South Korean forces used 57mm guns. They proved sadly inadequate against the Soviet-built T-3485 tanks that North Korea deployed. The T-3485 had 90mm of frontal armour, angled at 60 degrees, giving an effective thickness of about 180mm. The 57mm could not penetrate this at combat ranges. Once again, gun crews found themselves fighting with weapons that could not defeat enemy armour. The experience of American troops in Korea echoed the bitter lessons of Tunisia in 1943. Inadequate weapons meant dead soldiers, but the 57mm continued to serve in armies around the world through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Many nations that received American military aid under various programs were equipped with 57mm guns. They served in conflicts in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, South Asia. The gun's basic design was sound enough that it remained useful against lighter armoured vehicles and in infantry support roles long after it ceased to be effective against modern tanks. Looking back at the 57mm gun service in World War II, the story is complex. It was a weapon that was desperately needed, then partially obsolete almost as soon as it entered widespread service. It saved countless Allied lives by giving infantry a weapon that could actually kill German tanks. But it also cost lives when it was deployed in situations where it could not be effective. It represented both Allied industrial superiority, the ability to produce thousands of effective weapons, and Allied tactical challenges, the difficulty of keeping weapons development ahead of enemy armour improvements. The gun crews who served these weapons deserve immense credit. Operating a 57mm anti-tank gun in combat required courage that is hard to comprehend. Unlike tank crews, who had armour protection, anti-tank gunners were exposed. They sat behind a thin gun shield that would stop small arms fire but nothing larger. When German tanks fired back, there was no real protection. The only defence was to kill the enemy tank first. Anti-tank gunners had to hold their fire until targets were close enough for guaranteed hits. Firing at long range might damage a target but not stop it, and once you fired, you revealed your position. German tanks would immediately return fire, and German tank gunners were very good. The life expectancy of anti-tank gun crews in intense combat was measured in minutes. They knew this. They manned their weapons anyway. At Outpost Snipe, gun crews continued fighting even as their positions were being overrun. During the Battle of the Bulge, gunners stayed with their weapons in conditions that made survival unlikely. They did this because they understood that if they did not stop the tanks, the infantry behind them would be slaughtered. The 57mm gun was their tool. They used it to the absolute limits of its capability and their courage. The German reaction to the 57mm evolved over the course of the war. Initial encounters in North Africa brought shock and casualties. German after-action reports from 1942 noted with concern that British anti-tank weapons had suddenly become much more effective. Intelligence officers tried to determine what had changed. When captured 6-pounder guns were examined, German analysts were impressed by the design. Simple, robust, powerful. This was exactly the kind of weapon German engineers appreciated. But German responses were not limited to analysis. They developed tactics to counter the weapon. They up-armoured their tanks to defeat it. They introduced the Panther and Tiger specifically to restore armour superiority. The Germans were not static. They adapted, and their adaptations gradually neutralised the 57mm's effectiveness against heavy armour. But this adaptation itself is significant. It forced Germany to invest resources in heavier armour, bigger guns, more complex tanks. All of this strained German production capacity and logistics. Building and fielding Panthers and Tigers was much more expensive and time-consuming than building Panzer Mark IIIs and IVs. One could argue that Allied anti-tank weapons, including the 57mm, forced Germany into an arms race that Germany could not afford. Every time Germany upgraded armour, the Allies developed better anti-tank weapons. Germany responded with even heavier armour. This cycle consumed resources that Germany desperately needed elsewhere. In a war of attrition and industrial production, forcing your enemy to invest in increasingly expensive weapon systems is itself a form of victory. By late 1944, Germany was producing technologically sophisticated tanks that required tremendous resources to build. Meanwhile, Allied forces were employing not just tanks but also effective anti-tank guns, tank destroyers, fighter bombers with rockets, artillery, and coordinated combined arms tactics. The Germans had better individual tanks in many cases, but the Allies had a better system. And systems win wars. The 57mm gun was one component of that system. In the end, the story of the 57mm anti-tank gun is not a simple tale of a wonder weapon that won the war. It is a more nuanced story of a good weapon that filled a critical need at a crucial time. When it entered service in 1942, Allied infantry desperately needed something that could kill German tanks. The 57mm provided that capability. As the war progressed and German armour improved, the weapon struggled against the heaviest targets, but it remained effective against the majority of German armoured vehicles throughout the war. More importantly, it represented Allied determination to match and exceed German capabilities. When the 2-pounder and 37mm proved inadequate, the Allies did not simply accept inferiority. They developed and deployed better weapons, they adapted their tactics, they trained their soldiers, they outproduced their enemies. The 57mm gun was part of that larger pattern of adaptation and determination. For the German commanders who initially laughed at or dismissed Allied anti-tank capabilities, the 6-pounder and 57mm gun provided a harsh education. Tanks that had seemed invulnerable were suddenly dying at ranges the Germans thought were safe. The psychological impact on German tankers should not be underestimated. When you know that enemy anti-tank guns can kill you at 800 yards, you approach every engagement differently. You become more cautious. You demand more reconnaissance. You insist on artillery support before advancing. All of this slows your operations and reduces your effectiveness. From a purely technical standpoint, one could argue about whether the 57mm was the best possible design. Perhaps a different caliber or a different mounting system would have been superior. But in war, the perfect is the enemy of the good. The 57mm existed. It could be produced in large numbers, ammunition was available, crews could be trained on it relatively quickly, it was good enough to matter. And in the desperate circumstances of 1942 and 1943, good enough was exactly what the Allies needed. The legacy of the 57mm gun extends beyond its combat record. It represented a moment of transition in Allied military thinking. The recognition that technological superiority mattered, that producing large numbers of adequate weapons was better than small numbers of perfect weapons. That industrial capacity could be converted into battlefield advantage. These lessons shaped Allied strategy throughout the war and influenced military thinking for decades afterward. The Cold War arms race, the emphasis on mass production of reliable weapon systems, the integration of different weapon types into combined arms doctrines. All of these trace their lineage back to lessons learned in World War II. And the 57mm gun, with its combination of effectiveness, production numbers, and tactical limitations, exemplified those lessons perfectly. Today, surviving 57mm guns and 6-pounders can be found in museums and private collections around the world. They sit silent now, their barrels cold, their wheels motionless. But each one tells a story of gun crews who fought impossible odds, of German tank commanders who learned to fear a weapon they had initially dismissed, of Allied industrial might that could produce 15,000 complex weapons while fighting a global war, of the eternal arms race between armour and anti-armour, a race that continues to this day with modern tanks and anti-tank missiles. The 57mm anti-tank gun entered service at a moment when the Allies desperately needed it. It provided infantry with a weapon that could actually stop German armour. It forced German tactical and technical responses that strained their resources. It saved countless Allied lives by giving ground troops a fighting chance against tanks. And it served, in various forms and roles, for more than a decade after the war ended. For German commanders who faced it, the lesson was clear. Never underestimate your enemy's ability to adapt and improve. That fat gun on the two-wheeled carriage might not look impressive, but when it speaks, tanks die. And the laughter stops very quickly indeed. The 57mm anti-tank gun, a weapon that proved once again that wars are won not just by superior technology, but by superior determination to match and exceed whatever the enemy brings to the battlefield. And that lesson, like the gun itself, endures. The strategic implications of the 57mm gun's deployment extended far beyond individual tank kills. By mid-1943, German operational planning had to account for the presence of effective Allied anti-tank weapons in every defensive position. This fundamentally altered how the Wehrmacht conducted armoured operations. Before the widespread deployment of 6-pounders and 57mm guns, German armour could operate with a degree of freedom that verged on recklessness. Panzer commanders knew that Allied anti-tank defences were weak. They could push reconnaissance units forward aggressively. They could probe defensive lines looking for soft spots. The risk was acceptable because even if they encountered anti-tank guns, those guns were unlikely to cause serious damage at anything beyond point-blank range. The arrival of the 57mm changed this calculus completely. Now, every defensive position potentially held guns that could kill at 800 to 1,000 yards. German reconnaissance became more cautious, more methodical, and therefore slower. Time spent identifying anti-tank positions was time the defenders could use to strengthen their lines or call in reinforcements. In North Africa, this slowing effect contributed to the ultimate Allied victory. Rommel's Africa Corps had always relied on speed and audacity, lightning advances that threw Allied forces off balance. But by late 1942, with 6-pounders proliferating through British units, those lightning advances became much riskier. German tank commanders could no longer simply charge forward assuming their armour would protect them. They had to develop and execute more complex attack plans, combined arms assaults with infantry and artillery, suppressing anti-tank positions before armour advanced. This took time, and in desert warfare, where supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, time was a resource Germany did not have. The Tunisia campaign of early 1943 demonstrated both the effectiveness and the limitations of anti-tank gun deployment. American forces, initially equipped with inadequate 37mm guns, suffered devastating losses. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 saw German armour tear through American positions. Anti-tank guns were overrun or bypassed. The American troops fought bravely, but courage without effective weapons leads to slaughter. After Kasserine, the rush to re-equip American units with 57mm guns became urgent. By March 1943, more guns were arriving. The difference was immediate and noticeable. At El Guetert on March 23, 1943, elements of the 1st Infantry Division faced an attack by the 10th Panzer Division. This time, American anti-tank gunners were equipped with 57mm weapons. The German attack was stopped cold. Multiple Panzer Mark IIIs and Mark IVs were knocked out at ranges that had been safe just weeks earlier. The German commanders, expecting another easy victory like Kasserine, were shocked. American troops, humiliated at Kasserine, proved that with proper weapons they could fight effectively. The psychological transformation cannot be overstated. After Kasserine, American morale was shattered. Troops questioned their equipment, their training, their leadership. The successful defence at El Ghoutar, enabled in large part by effective anti-tank guns, restored confidence. American soldiers learned that they could stand against German armour and win. This lesson would prove crucial in the campaigns to come. But the Tunisia campaign also revealed a disturbing truth about anti-tank gun employment. Guns without proper tactical deployment were worse than useless. They gave commanders false confidence. At Kasserine, some American 37mm guns had been positioned on forward slopes, clearly visible to German observers. They were destroyed by artillery before the tanks even arrived. Other guns were positioned without infantry support and were overrun by German infantry who approached under covering fire. The guns themselves were well maintained and the crews were brave. But tactical incompetence negated their potential effectiveness. This led to a crash program in anti-tank tactics. Training manuals were rewritten. Officers who had combat experience in North Africa were rotated back to training units to share lessons learned. The key principles were hammered home repeatedly. Concealment was survival. An anti-tank gun that the enemy could see was already dead. Positions needed to be carefully camouflaged with only the barrel protruding. Firing positions should be on reverse slopes when possible, protecting the gun from direct observation. Fields of fire should be planned to maximize the chance of side shots against advancing armor. Each gun needed infantry support to protect against enemy infantry assault, and perhaps most importantly, guns needed covered withdrawal routes. Once a position was compromised, the crew needed to be able to displace to a secondary position. Staying in a discovered position was suicide. These lessons were learned in blood in North Africa. By the time of the Sicily invasion in July 1943, American anti-tank doctrine had matured considerably. But doctrine and reality do not always align. Sicily's terrain presented unique challenges. The island's mountainous interior and narrow coastal roads created choke points where armour had to advance in column, perfect terrain for anti-tank ambushes. But moving 2,700-pound guns up mountain roads was exhausting work. Crews manhandled their weapons into position, often dragging them the final distance when trucks could go no further. Once positioned, these guns dominated the approaches. German and Italian armour attempting to move through the valleys faced carefully planned killing zones. But the static nature of the defence also meant that once German commanders identified gun positions, they could bring overwhelming artillery fire to bear. Sicily saw the development of a tactic that would become standard: the sacrificial first wave. German commanders, knowing that Allied anti-tank guns were positioned in the hills, would send a small armoured probe forward. The probe's mission was not to break through. It was to force the anti-tank guns to reveal their positions by firing. Once the guns revealed themselves, German artillery would target those positions while the main armoured force waited. After sufficient artillery had been delivered to suppress or destroy the anti-tank guns, the real attack would commence. This tactic worked often enough to be concerning. Anti-tank gun crews faced a terrible dilemma. If they fired at the probe, they revealed their positions and would be shelled. If they held fire, the probe might penetrate the defensive line and cause havoc in the rear areas. The solution, when it could be implemented, was defence in depth. Multiple lines of anti-tank guns positioned so that if the forward line was forced to reveal itself and was subsequently destroyed, secondary positions could engage the follow-on attack. But defence in depth required more guns than were often available. The Italian campaign that followed Sicily amplified these challenges. Italy's mountainous terrain was anti-tank gun country. Narrow valleys, limited roads, choke points everywhere. Properly positioned anti-tank guns could dominate entire sectors. But the same terrain that favoured defensive gun placement also made supply and repositioning nightmarish. Moving 57mm guns up mountain trails required enormous effort. Ammunition resupply was difficult. Wounded crews could not be easily evacuated, and German forces, fighting from prepared positions with excellent observation, could often spot gun emplacements despite camouflage efforts. The fighting around Monte Cassino in early 1944 exemplified these difficulties. American and British forces trying to break through German defensive lines relied heavily on anti-tank guns to protect flanks and consolidate captured ground. But German counterattacks, supported by assault guns and tanks, repeatedly forced Allied units back. Anti-tank guns that could not be withdrawn in time were lost. Gun crew casualties in Italy were horrific. In some infantry divisions, anti-tank platoons suffered 40% casualties during major offensives. The men who served these weapons knew the odds. They knew that once combat was joined, survival was unlikely if the enemy located their position. They manned their guns anyway. The Medal of Honor citations from the Italian campaign include multiple anti-tank gunners who continued fighting after the rest of their crews were killed. Men who single-handedly served their weapons, loading and firing alone, until they too were killed or wounded. The conspicuous gallantry required to stand behind a thin gun shield while German tanks fired directly at you transcends ordinary courage. It approaches the superhuman. Yet thousands of men did exactly this day after day throughout the Italian campaign. The replacement system struggled to keep anti-tank units at strength. Each casualty had to be replaced not just with a warm body but with a trained gunner, someone who knew the weapon, knew the tactics, could be trusted to hold under fire. Training programs in the United States and Britain worked overtime to produce these specialists, but the pipeline from training to combat took months. Units were often forced to operate under strength or to fill positions with minimally trained replacements. The planning for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, included extensive consideration of anti-tank requirements. Allied planners knew that German armoured reserves would counterattack the beachhead. The invasion force needed sufficient anti-tank capability to defeat these counterattacks. Each infantry division landing in Normandy included an anti-tank battalion equipped with 57mm guns. Additional guns were allocated to regimental anti-tank companies. Tank destroyer battalions with heavier weapons provided mobile anti-tank reserves. The plan was comprehensive. The execution was chaotic. The Normandy landings on June 6, 1944 were conducted under intense enemy fire and difficult conditions. Heavy equipment, including anti-tank guns, was often lost during the landing. Guns that made it ashore were frequently separated from their crews or their towing vehicles. Ammunition was scattered across the beaches. In the first critical hours of the invasion, when German counterattacks were most dangerous, many units had fewer anti-tank guns available than planned. Omaha Beach was particularly chaotic. The initial assault waves took devastating casualties. Heavy equipment, including anti-tank guns, was destroyed or abandoned at the water's edge. By mid-morning, American forces clinging to a narrow beachhead had virtually no anti-tank capability. If German armour had counterattacked in strength at this moment, the consequences could have been catastrophic. The absence of a major German armoured counterattack on D-Day has been analysed extensively. Multiple factors contributed: German command confusion, Allied air superiority, the dispersion of panzer reserves. But among the factors was the German High Command's belief that the Normandy landings were a feint and the real invasion would come at Calais. This miscalculation gave Allied forces time to get organised, to bring more equipment ashore to establish defensive positions. By the time German armour did counterattack in strength, on June 7th and 8th, American anti-tank defences were much stronger. The 57mm guns had been landed, positioned, supplied with ammunition. They were ready. The bocage country of Normandy, with its small fields surrounded by thick hedgerows, created a nightmarish environment for both armour and anti-tank guns. German tanks could approach within 100 yards before being visible. Anti-tank guns positioned to cover one hedgerow-enclosed field had no visibility into adjacent fields. The 800 to 1,000 yard engagement ranges that made the 57mm effective in open terrain were impossible in the bocage. Engagements happened at 200 yards or less, often much less. At these ranges, the 57mm was absolutely lethal against any German tank, even Panthers, if the crew could get a shot into the side or rear. But getting that shot required nerves of steel. Gun crews had to hold fire until the last possible moment, waiting for German tanks to close into point-blank range, because firing too early might damage but not stop the target. And a damaged but mobile German tank would immediately return fire and destroy the anti-tank position. The Battle of the Hedgerows saw anti-tank tactics refined to a brutal simplicity. Let them get close. Kill them fast. Withdraw before their supporting infantry arrives. Repeat until you are dead or the battle is won. The presence of Panthers in Normandy forced tactical adaptations. American 57mm gunners learned quickly that frontal shots against Panthers were useless. The shells simply bounced off the sloped frontal armour. Side shots against the hull were effective. Rear shots were guaranteed kills. But getting those side and rear shots required coordination with infantry and other supporting arms. Infantry would pin the Panther with small arms fire and bazookas, forcing it to button up and limiting the crew's visibility. While the tank was distracted, the 57mm gun would be manoeuvred into a flanking position. The gun would fire, ideally achieving a kill with the first shot, and then immediately displace before German infantry could locate and assault the position. This required extensive training and coordination. Units that executed these tactics well had good success rates. Units that tried to fight Panthers frontally suffered terrible losses. Tiger tanks were even worse. The 57mm gun could not penetrate a Tiger's frontal armour at any combat range. Side shots were possible but required ideal angles. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy an anti-tank position at ranges where the 57mm could not even threaten the Tiger. American doctrine for engaging Tigers was simple. Do not engage unless you have no choice. Call in air support, call in artillery, call in tank destroyers with heavier guns. If forced to engage with a 57mm, go for track shots to immobilize the Tiger, then call for help. Trying to kill a Tiger with a 57mm gun was nearly suicidal. But desperate men in desperate situations attempt desperate things. There are documented cases of 57mm crews engaging Tigers, and, through a combination of luck and extraordinary courage, achieving kills. One crew in Normandy fired 16 rounds at a Tiger, aiming for the same spot on the side armour repeatedly, until they finally penetrated and started a fire that forced the crew to abandon the tank. 16 rounds. That meant staying in position, continuing to load and fire, while the Tiger rotated its turret toward them and returned fire. The entire crew was killed by the Tiger's final shot, but they had stopped the tank. Their sacrifice allowed the infantry they were supporting to hold the position. The breakout from Normandy in late July 1944 changed the nature of the fighting. Operation Cobra punched through German lines, and American armour raced into open country. Mobile warfare returned. Anti-tank guns, designed for defensive combat, struggled to keep up with the advance. Units outran their 57mm guns repeatedly. The guns, towed by trucks or half-tracks, could not match the speed of armoured columns. They would arrive at newly captured town hours or even days after the initial seizure. This created vulnerability. German counterattacks against thinly held positions sometimes succeeded because anti-tank guns had not yet arrived. The solution was to prioritise anti-tank assets for units holding critical terrain. But this meant that advancing spearheads often had minimal anti-tank capability, relying on tank destroyers and bazookas. The risk was accepted because speed of advance was judged more important than perfect security. But there were units that paid for this decision with their lives when German armour caught them before adequate anti-tank defences were established. The race across France in August 1944 saw thousands of German soldiers captured. Among the prisoners were tank crews. Allied intelligence teams interviewed these prisoners extensively, seeking information about German tactics, morale, and equipment. The interviews revealed interesting perspectives on the 57mm gun. Most German tankers respected the weapon. They described it as effective against lighter German tanks at all ranges, and dangerous to heavier tanks if it achieved flank shots. But they also noted that by late 1944, they feared American air power and artillery far more than anti-tank guns. A German Panther commander captured near Nancy in September 1944 stated that anti-tank guns could be avoided by careful route selection and reconnaissance. But fighter bombers were everywhere and could not be avoided. Artillery could be called down on any position at any time. The threat environment had become so complex that anti-tank guns, while dangerous, were just one of many concerns. This suggests that the 57mm strategic importance by late 1944 was less about the individual kills it achieved and more about how it contributed to the overall defensive capability that allowed Allied forces to hold captured ground while armour and air power ranged ahead. The Hurtgen Forest battles of late 1944 returned combat to the grinding close-range fighting that characterised the bocage: dense forest, limited visibility, mud and cold. American divisions attacking through the Hurtgen Forest took staggering casualties. Anti-tank units suffered disproportionately. The forest terrain made it almost impossible to position 57mm guns effectively. Fields of fire were limited to a few dozen yards. German tanks, supported by infantry, could approach to point-blank range under cover. When they attacked, the engagements were decided in seconds. Multiple anti-tank guns were overrun before they could fire a single shot. The survivors described combat in the Hurtgen Forest as nightmarish. You could hear German armour approaching through the trees but could not see it. When it finally appeared, it was close enough to touch. Crews fired desperately at whatever target presented itself, and then tried to flee before German infantry arrived. The casualty rates were unsustainable. Some anti-tank companies were effectively destroyed, reduced to a handful of survivors who were consolidated with other units. Then came the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major attack in the West. Launched on December 16, 1944, the offensive caught American forces by surprise. German armour, including Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers, poured through weak points in American lines. In the first days of the battle, American anti-tank defences were overwhelmed in many sectors. The speed and violence of the German attack scattered units. Anti-tank guns were abandoned when their positions were overrun. Others were lost when their towing vehicles were destroyed, leaving the guns immobile and unable to retreat. But at key road junctions and towns, American forces established defensive positions and fought with desperate determination. The defence of Saint-Vith and Bastogne have been chronicled extensively. Less well known are the dozens of small unit actions where anti-tank gun crews held their positions against overwhelming odds. At the town of Lanzerath on the first day of the offensive, an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, reinforced with a single 57mm gun, held off an entire German regiment for hours. The gun crew destroyed multiple vehicles before the gun was finally knocked out. The delay imposed on the German advance was critical in allowing other American units to organise defences. Throughout the Bulge, 57mm gun crews fought with extraordinary courage. They knew that German armour breakthroughs threatened the entire American position in Europe. They knew that if the Germans reached the Meuse River and captured Allied supply depots, the war could be prolonged by months or years, so they stood their ground. One gun crew near. Elsenborn Ridge continued fighting even after their gun's breech mechanism was damaged by a near miss from German artillery. They manually loaded and fired each round, a process that took several minutes per shot instead of the normal seconds. They stayed in position for 6 hours, firing whenever German armour appeared until American reinforcements arrived and they could finally withdraw. Both crewmen were wounded. Both refused evacuation until their gun was recovered. This was not exceptional. This was typical of the determination shown by anti-tank gunners throughout the Bulge. The ultimate failure of the German Ardennes offensive owed to many factors: Allied air superiority once the weather cleared, German fuel shortages, the failure to capture key road junctions, stubborn American resistance. Among those factors was the effective employment of anti-tank weapons, including the 57mm gun. While the gun struggled against the heaviest German armour, it remained effective against the Panzer Mark IVs and assault guns that made up the bulk of German armoured forces. And even against Panthers and Tigers, the gun crews found ways to contribute, immobilising tanks with track shots, forcing tanks to button up and lose situational awareness, providing covering fire while infantry manoeuvred with bazookas. The 57mm could not win battles alone, but it could hold positions long enough for other weapon systems to be brought to bear. And in defensive combat, buying time is often the difference between defeat and survival. By early 1945, with Allied forces pushing into Germany itself, the 57mm gun was clearly obsolete as a frontline anti-tank weapon. Newer weapons with better armour penetration were available. The 76mm gun on late-model Sherman tanks could defeat Panthers frontally at reasonable ranges. The 90mm gun on American tank destroyers and the new M26 Pershing heavy tank could engage any German armour on equal terms. But 15,000 57mm guns had been built. They were in the inventory, spread throughout the army, familiar to crews who had trained on them for months or years, so they remained in service. Increasingly, they were used in infantry support roles. The high explosive ammunition that had been so desperately needed in Normandy was now available in reasonable quantities. The 57mm with HE rounds was an effective weapon against fortified positions, machine gun nests and infantry in buildings. It was also used for indirect fire, functioning almost as a small artillery piece. The flat trajectory limited its effectiveness in this role, but when direct fire was not possible, crews improvised. They calculated trajectories, adjusted for range, and dropped shells onto targets they could not see. The results were mixed, but it was better than having the gun sit idle. The final battles in Germany saw some 57mm guns still employed in their original anti-tank role, but increasingly they were backups to heavier weapons. The primary anti-tank defence was now provided by tank destroyers, tanks, and air power. The 57mm covered rear areas, protected supply lines, guarded bridges and crossroads. This was not glamorous work, but it was necessary. German commanders, even in the final weeks of the war, occasionally launched small-scale counterattacks with whatever armour they could scrape together. These attacks were usually stopped by American air power or tank destroyers, but sometimes a handful of German tanks would slip through and threaten rear area targets. When this happened, the 57mm gun crews in those rear areas were the last line of defence, and they fought with the same determination they had shown throughout the war. There are records of gun crews in supply depots, miles behind the front lines, engaging German tanks that had broken through. These were old guns, worn barrels, tired crews, but they did their jobs. The statistics of 57mm gun employment during World War II are incomplete. Records were not always kept meticulously during combat. Gun crews did not always have time to confirm kills. Many engagements happened in confused situations where multiple weapons were firing simultaneously, making attribution difficult. But the available records suggest that American 57mm guns claimed approximately 1,200 German armoured vehicles destroyed. This includes tanks, assault guns, self-propelled guns, and armoured cars. British 6-pounder guns, used for a longer period and in more theatres, claimed considerably more. The combined total for British and American 57mm and 6-pounder guns likely exceeds 5,000 enemy armoured vehicles destroyed. These numbers are significant, but they do not tell the complete story. The true value of the 57mm gun cannot be measured simply in kills. It must be measured in German attacks that were never launched because anti-tank defences were too strong, in German tactical plans that had to be more elaborate because they had to account for effective anti-tank weapons, in Allied infantry who could defend positions with confidence because they had weapons that could actually stop tanks, in time bought for reinforcements to arrive or counterattacks to be organised. The production of 57mm guns and ammunition represented a significant industrial effort. Each gun required precision machining of dozens of components. The barrel alone was a complex piece of engineering, requiring specialised lathes and skilled operators. The recoil mechanism, the traversing mechanism, the elevation system. All of these had to be manufactured to tight tolerances. American and British factories produced these weapons while simultaneously building tanks, aircraft, ships, and countless other items. The fact that over 15,000 guns were produced while fighting a global war on multiple fronts demonstrates industrial capacity that Germany could not match. For every 57mm gun, ammunition had to be produced. Millions of rounds. Each round required a brass cartridge case, propellant, a primer, and a projectile. The projectiles themselves came in multiple types: armour-piercing shot with hardened steel cores, armour-piercing capped shot with a soft cap to prevent shattering on impact, high-explosive shells with contact fuses. Each type required different manufacturing processes. The logistics of getting the right ammunition to the right place at the right time was a challenge that Allied logistics personnel solved repeatedly, under difficult conditions throughout the war. The training pipeline for 57mm gun crews was extensive. Crews went through basic training, then advanced infantry training, then specialised anti-tank training. They learned gunnery, ballistics, tactics, maintenance. They practised on ranges until they could load and fire in their sleep. They studied German tank recognition, learning to identify different models by silhouette. They memorised armour thicknesses and vulnerable points. A fully trained anti-tank gun crew represented an investment of months of training time and considerable resources. When these crews were killed in combat, replacing them was difficult. The replacement training programs tried to produce crew members as quickly as possible, but combat veterans knew that newly trained replacements were vulnerable. They lacked the instincts that combat veterans developed. They made mistakes that veterans knew to avoid. Integrating replacements into existing crews was a constant challenge for unit commanders. The human cost of anti-tank operations is difficult to quantify precisely, but casualty rates among anti-tank units were consistently higher than among regular infantry. These men were targeted by enemy armour, artillery and infantry. They could not take cover in the same way riflemen could. Their positions, once identified, became priority targets. Many crews were killed without ever firing a shot, destroyed by artillery before combat was even joined. The post-war assessment of the 57mm gun by military historians and analysts has been mixed. Some argue that the gun was obsolete almost from the moment it entered service, unable to defeat the latest German armour. Others contend that it was exactly what was needed when it was needed, and that judging it by its late war performance against Panthers and Tigers is unfair. The truth lies somewhere between these positions. The 57mm was a good weapon that filled a critical capability gap in 1942 and 1943. By 1944, it was being surpassed by newer threats, but it remained useful in many situations. The decision to produce it in such large numbers was justified by the circumstances of 1941 and 1942, when Allied forces desperately needed effective anti-tank weapons. The fact that technology advanced and made the gun less effective was inevitable. No weapon remains state-of-the-art forever. What matters is whether the weapon was effective during its period of service. By that measure, the 57mm succeeded. For German commanders who faced the 6-pounder and 57mm gun in combat, the weapon represented a turning point. It marked the end of the period when German armour could dominate battlefields through superior protection and firepower. After 1942, German tankers had to respect Allied anti-tank capabilities. They had to fight more carefully, more defensively. The psychological impact of this shift contributed to the gradual erosion of German tactical effectiveness. When you believe your armour is superior, you fight with confidence and aggression. When you know the enemy has weapons that can kill you at range, doubt creeps in. That doubt manifests as hesitation, as caution, as opportunities not taken. The strategic consequences of forcing this shift on German armour tactics rippled throughout the remainder of the war. The 57mm anti-tank gun did not win World War II. No single weapon did. But it contributed to Allied victory in ways both measurable and immeasurable. It killed German tanks. It protected Allied infantry. It forced German tactical and industrial responses. It demonstrated Allied determination to match enemy capabilities. And it provided thousands of soldiers with a weapon they could trust, in circumstances where trust in your weapons could mean the difference between life and death. The gun crews who served these weapons deserve to be remembered. Their courage, standing behind a thin gun shield against multi-ton armoured vehicles, exemplified the human dimension of technological warfare. Machines do not win wars, people do. Armed with the best weapons their nations can provide, yes. But ultimately, victory comes down to the willingness of individuals to stand their ground, do their duty, and trust that their sacrifice matters. The men who served the 57mm anti-tank gun in World War II did exactly that. And for that, they earned their place in history.